Just type in, if you will, type in your question box and let me know that you can hear me. Awesome, awesome. I see Lizzie. Hi. All right. Seems like sound is good. Everything's good. We will be recording this webinar, just so everyone knows. And we will go ahead and get started. And there will be time for questions at the end. So hang on to your questions if you have any. And let's go ahead and get started. So good morning. I'm so thankful that you have joined me today for our webinar on the fundamentals of non-binary and transgender victims advocacy. I look for this presentation to last around an hour, maybe an hour and a half, depending on questions and depending on what else we get into a discussion about. So my name is Chloe McMurray. I think it pops up on your all's screen as Christina Calvin, but that is not my name. I'm Chloe. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a program specialist at the Tennessee Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. I work primarily with organizations who serve marginalized and minority populations as victims or survivors. I also chair an inclusivity committee across the state of Tennessee, and so my contact information is on here. If you have any questions about that or about anything at all, you can get a hold of me after this presentation. And first, I do want to acknowledge that we may be talking about some heavy topics: sexual assault, domestic violence, victimization, suicide, discrimination. So I want to acknowledge that these topics can be heavy. And if at any time you need to step away, please take care of yourself first. This presentation, like I said, will be recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube page later on this week or next. So you won't miss anything. If you need to step away for a few minutes, you can always come back and you can watch it or rewatch it. There will also be certificates for this webinar sent out afterwards, as well as evaluations sent out directly following it. So please look for those. And if you have any questions or if you don't get a certificate, of course, email me and we will get your certificate right away. And I would also like to acknowledge that although I do identify as a queer woman, I am a cisgender woman. So this presentation is coming from my experience as a white cisgender person. And if you're watching this and you are not a cisgender person, and I say something wrong, or I get something wrong, or you think I need to add something in, you have a new resource, anything like that, please feel free to connect with me either at the end when we have questions or in an email later on. I'm constantly learning new things. We are all constantly learning new things. And I want to be as open and honest with you all as I can. So with that, today we are going to be discussing some of the terminology that goes along with helping transgender and gender non-binary survivors and victims of intimate partner violence and understanding what some of those terms mean. I won't spend loads of time with terminology because it's not necessary. I'm going to function off of the assumption that you know a lot of this terminology. And if I'm saying some things that you don't know, either ask me at the end or pause right here. There's another webinar I did a few months ago on queering violence. We went over the terminology. So that would be a really good prerequisite for this, but of course is not required for you to watch this. You'll still get valuable information from this, even if you've not seen that. And then we will discuss how important using a person's correct pronouns are and how some of the statistics that the transgender community face impact the services that they need or don't seek out or do seek out. We will spend a good bulk of our time talking about those barriers that transgender folks face when coming into shelter or when seeking services. And then we will wrap up and spend the rest of our time talking about how to create those safe and welcoming environments, both in shelter, in your communities, in your organization. And okay, so let's dive in. What is non-binary? This is one of the first terms we're going to talk about. What does non-binary mean if someone identifies that way? Non-binary is, and this definition comes from the Human Rights Campaign, hrc.com, I think. And it says that non-binary is describing a person who does not identify exclusively as a man or a woman. Non-binary people may identify as being both a man and a woman, somewhere in between a man and a woman and some other gender, or as falling completely outside of these categories. And while many also identify as transgender, not all non-binary people identify that way. They fall somewhere outside of this binary that our society teaches us to believe in, this male and female only binary. And a lot of conversations revolve around transgender folks, but not a lot of conversations revolve around non-binary folks. So it's always important to keep non-binary victims in consideration when you're carrying out your policies, when you're doing your intake paperwork, or just your day-to-day practices. And maybe you've seen this before, maybe you haven't, but this is the gender unicorn. Or maybe you've seen their less colorful pal, the genderbread person. Either way, this is the gender unicorn, and this is just a very helpful tool to easily explain and get away from the binary of only male and female, and to differentiate all the ways that gender impacts us. We have gender identity, how we feel, how we think, how we see ourselves in our head and in our mind's eye. We have gender expression, the second one, the green one, and you can see it kind of outlined on the side there, that it is the way we look on the outside, the way we dress, or the way we talk. And then, sorry, we've got some folks that can't hear. Is your sound better? Can you guys hear me now? I don't want to miss you all. All right. Okay, so the way we dress on the outside, and then there is the sex that you were assigned at birth. This is most likely going to be male or female or possibly intersex. And I think the intersex community is another community that gets left out of a lot of these conversations too. So keep them in consideration, but this webinar is not going to cover the scope of the services that intersex folks will need. And then we have who we are physically and or emotionally attracted to or attached to. And yes, these are different. So for instance, I identify as a woman and I express myself femininely. I was assigned female at birth, and I am physically attracted to men, women, and other genders, but I am emotionally attracted to women. And I, you, anyone could be any combination of these. Transgender doesn't look a certain way, quote around look. Non-binary doesn't look, quote, a certain way. And neither does gender fluid, gender queer, neither does gay or lesbian or bisexual or intersex or straight. It's all on a spectrum. And so rewiring your brain to think about gender and sexuality and identity as a spectrum and not binary will help you so much in the way that you help your clients and the way that you go about your day-to-day living. Undoing your own personal biases and the narrative that we were taught growing up, we were taught in school, we were taught by religion or whatever, is a big part of advocacy. And sometimes it's learning something new every day, and that's okay. It's worth the effort, and we should never ever stop this learning process. All right, let's talk about pronouns. Pronouns, what are they? Why do we use them? I am a grammar nerd. I love language, I love literature, I love grammar and writing and all the things that come with that part of learning. I have a degree in English. I'm getting my master's in English. So I love for even a brief moment to be talking about something like pronouns. So we all know this. We use pronouns in place of a person's name. That's all they are. If we are, hypothetically, we're talking about Neil Patrick Harris, and I say, Neil Patrick Harris absolutely loves tangerines. I don't know if he does. This is just a hypothetical. He may actually hate tangerines. But I go on and I say, yes, Neil Patrick Harris loves them. They're Neil Patrick Harris's favorite food. Neil Patrick Harris would rather eat tangerines than anything else. And like, he's got a long name. And that's a lot of times to say that name. So of course, we just swap his name for he, him, because those are the pronouns that he uses. Those are the pronouns that he has let folks know that he identifies with. People use he, him, she, her, they, them, z, zir. Primarily, it is non-binary or gender non-conforming folks who will use the they, them, or z, zir pronouns, not always, but mostly. And why pronouns? Why even bring this up? So statistically, using a person's pronouns is really important. Studies have shown that by choosing to use a trans or non-binary youth's correct name and pronouns reduces their risk of suicide by 56%, and that's huge. And using pronouns, it's a way of saying, I see you and I acknowledge you, I respect you, I respect the human in you. And please note that I'm saying their pronouns, not their chosen pronouns, not their preferred pronouns, because using words like chosen or preferred kind of indicates that that was a choice, that that's what they prefer, that that's what they chose to go by. And it's just a matter of identity. It is not a matter of choice. So please always keep that in mind when asking for a person's pronouns or when discussing pronouns. So much of our affirmation with our clients and participants is acknowledging their existence, their humanity, and their authenticity. So saying that we see them as they are. They don't have to hide or be someone else for us. And studies, like I said, studies have shown that doing this reduces risk of suicide by 56%. And so we use pronouns, and most of the time, most of our lives, we've been taught to sort of just assume someone's pronouns based on things like the way that they're dressing, their mannerisms, their hair length, their height, and all these physical things. And our brains are taking these subconscious point values and assigning genders to people in our heads, and we're not even consciously aware of it. It's just this habit that our brains have. And so breaking this habit is critical to moving forward progressively. And there's a growing population of folks who don't identify with the binary and don't identify with the norms and societal gender roles that we've been taught. So unlearning this is key and is imperative. I think that this quote, the quote that's on the screen is brilliant, is perfect. I love Jonathan Van Ness. And he's just talking about the way that our masculine and feminine energy evolves and exists. Jonathan Van Ness came out as non-binary last year, and although he identifies as genderqueer, he does still go by he, him pronouns. And he says about that, he says, I didn't think I was allowed to be non-conforming or genderqueer or non-binary. I was just always like a gay man because that's just the label I thought I had to be. I know that's not the quote on the screen, but you can read that yourself. So just this new, and not even new, but more open way, more accessible way, more educated way for folks to identify has given people power over their identity and made people feel safer and more comfortable to just be who they are and be comfortable in their own skin. And so with that, let's dive into, let's talk about terminology in a different way. So it's a little funny. I have spent several minutes talking about terminology and pronouns and how important they are. And now I'm going to tell you that while being important, terms are also absolutely meaningless. I do want to address this idea that sometimes it seems sort of paradoxical to ask service providers to not only pay attention to what label their client is using, but to also not be quick to label a client. The answer is simply complicated on how do I get this right. It's a little complicated, but it's simple. It is that paradox. It's a paradox of knowing that those labels are helping an individual define themselves in terms that haven't always been taught to them, nor are the quote norm that society presents them with. But that if we are only going off of labels, we will miss something. So the key to avoiding unnecessary labeling is to just listen. Listen with the intent to understand instead of checking a box. Sometimes we get in a flow of question and answering and box checking, especially when we're doing intake or when on a crisis call. So reminding ourselves that statistics aren't as important as the people, and the labels aren't as important as understanding. There is not necessarily a right or wrong or incorrect or correct way to getting the language right. What there is a difference of treating folks with respect and dignity for the language that makes them feel comfortable and aligns best with their identity. So with that, let's dive into some statistics, because despite not being the end all be all, it's important to know how drastic the rates of violence are against non-binary and transgender folks. These stats are from the National Center for Transgender Equality. Transgender and gender non-conforming folks face injustice, prejudice, and violence in so many different areas of their worlds. In childhood homes, in schools, in court systems, and other systems that are supposed to protect and educate them, in workplaces and doctors' offices, when working with landlords and going to the grocery store. Most trans folks experience some sort of discrimination on a daily basis. And these are the stories that make up this data. And I want you to remember that for the next few slides. These numbers aren't just numbers. They're not just stats. They are stories. They are souls with lives who have experienced injustice. Statistics documenting transgender people's experience of sexual violence indicate shockingly high levels of sexual abuse and assault. 1 in 2 transgender individuals are sexually abused or assaulted at some point in their lives. 1 in 2. Some reports estimate that transgender survivors may experience rates of sexual assault up to 66%. This is often coupled with physical assaults or abuse. This indicates that the majority of transgender individuals are living with the aftermath of trauma and of course, the fear of possible re-victimization. Sexual violence has been found to be even higher in some subpopulations with the transgender community, so including transgender youth, transgender people of color, individuals living with disabilities, homeless individuals, and those who are involved in sex work. Acts of hate violence, such as harassment, stalking, vandalism, and physical sexual assault, are often supported by more socially sanctioned expressions of transphobia, biphobia, and homophobia, and they are intended to send a message to queer communities. Many LGBTQ+ people also face substantial bias because they also belong to other traditionally marginalized groups along other axes of identity, such as race, class, incarceration history, immigration status, or ability membership in more than one traditionally marginalized community, and this can increase targeting for severe violence. The majority of people who died in violent hate crimes against LGBTQ+ people were transgender people, many of whom were gender non-conforming or non-binary. Sexual assault and or genital mutilation either before or after their murders was a frequent occurrence. Hate crimes are more prevalent against people of color. In 2009, 53% of LGBTQ+ hate crime victims were people of color. That is more than half of queer victims were victims of color. I want you to really remember that. In 2009, 17% of all reported violent hate crimes against LGBTQ+ people were directed against those who identified themselves as transgender, with most 11% of all hate crimes identifying as transgender women. The remainder identified as transgender men, genderqueer, gender questioning, or intersex. Sexual assaults can be perpetrated by any individual. We know this. However, it is always particularly startling when professionals who are in helping roles, protective roles, abuse their power and sexually assault individuals they are supposed to be serving. So 15% of transgender individuals report being sexually assaulted while in police custody or jail, which more than doubles to 32% for African American transgender people. 5 to 9% of transgender survivors were sexually assaulted by police officers, and another 10% were assaulted by healthcare professionals. Another example, the 2011 Injustice at Every Turn, a report of the National Transgender Discrimination Survey, found that 12% of transgender youth report being sexually assaulted in K-12 settings by peers or educational staff. 13% of African American transgender people surveyed were sexually assaulted in the workplace, and 22% of homeless transgender individuals were assaulted while staying in shelters. Between 22 and 38% of trans people report having been harassed non-physically by police, with upwards of 15% experiencing physical assault and abuse, and with 7% of those assaults being sexual by law enforcement. In healthcare, trans folks report being met with violence, as well as with 26% experiencing physical assault and 10% experiencing sexual assault. This is in a healthcare setting, in a place that is supposed to serve them, keep them safe, make them healthy, and they are being assaulted. And one of the worst, I think, is the hate and violence. These are all horrible, obviously, but is the hate and violence that transgender youth experience at school. School, this place of learning and maybe hope, and definitely a place of support. 78% of gender non-conforming youth reported significant abuse at school. Of this abuse, 31% of it was at the hands of teachers. I don't know about you, but when I read that, my mouth dropped, my jaw hit the floor. 31%, 78%, those are huge numbers. And all of these numbers should be at zero. None of these numbers should be this high, but especially the numbers at the hands of educators. They should just be non-existent. And of course, there's the question of how to stop this abuse, how to prevent it, and it all falls on education and a willingness to unlearn harmful rhetorics and biases that people grew up with and that society sometimes enforces on us. And this is especially true because these identities, these non-binary people are not going away. These numbers aren't going away. People are not going to suddenly revert to closet living just to appease someone else's discomfort. Studies have shown that 4.5% of youth ages 12 to 17 identify as gender nonconforming. Excuse me. That's a substantial number, even if it doesn't sound like it. Like Jonathan Van Ness said, he was genderqueer from the beginning. He knew it. He always was, but he didn't have a name for it. He didn't know what to call himself. He didn't know what identity he fit in with. And I think as we continue to study and learn things about gender, about our bodies, about our minds, we'll continue to find terms and identities that best align with ourselves, with how we see ourselves and how we want the world to see us. And I think it would come as no surprise to anyone that the risk of suicide among transgender and gender non-binary folks is higher than almost any other demographic of people. 41%. That's almost half of the entire transgender population identify as having attempted suicide in their lifetimes. This is not suicidal ideation alone. These are attempts. This is active suicidal tendencies. And like I said earlier, doing simple things like acknowledging a person's pronouns and respecting that, using their name, their correct name, and loads of other things that we will talk about later on. But these things call for basic human respect and human decency. This dismantling of hateful transphobic rhetoric in order to dismantle internalized homophobia and transphobia. That's how we make this number go down. And so it's easy for me to sit here and say, we got to enact change. We got to bring awareness. We got to educate people. We got to. Because I am not a person who is experiencing transphobia. And if you're not transgender, then neither are you. And I am not from trans experience. And so we are the ones who must be willing to help knock down these barriers, knock down the things that hold transgender and non-binary folks from seeking services. According to a 2011 study by Forge and the National Transgender Center for Equality, and let me just tell you, Forge Forward is the most amazing source of knowledge and information for advocating for transgender folks. Just my little plug there. But according to the study, there were 10 top reasons why folks needing services did not feel safe or comfortable to come forward and seek domestic and sexual violence services. The study showed fear, places not being trans welcoming or trans friendly, trans inclusive, not being culturally competent, the staff not being culturally competent, that they didn't know what the service was, what services were even offered. An organization's reputation sometimes dissuade them from seeking services. A lot of shelters, a lot of services are still woman focused, and that is to say they are cis woman focused. As we all know, there's shame, embarrassment, and stigma that comes with any survivor seeking services, but especially for transgender folks. And then you have retaliation, concern that it would make things worse. You have systemic problems, and you have cost of seeking services. So we're going to talk about each one of these, and fear is bold because it's got 2 slides, so just bear with me. Fear is the, I skipped one. Fear is the number one, and it's because it is a fully loaded reason and might not even be for the reasons that you're thinking. They reported a fear of further abuse, not from their abuser, but from service providers. Experiencing hostility, rejection, judgment, discrimination, again, by service providers, not just their abusers. Another huge fear is being outed, either by service providers, by folks nearby, witnessing them going in, this is especially true for rural areas, where everyone knows everyone. I'm from a super rural area, and I can verify everyone at least knows of everyone. Or even by other clients. They had concerns about being denied services, and as we know from data, people are routinely denied services at extremely high rates. So transgender people have a huge fear of police misconduct. As we are seeing in our country right now, there are lots of conversations about police brutality and police misconduct, both in terms of race and in terms of other minority populations. And I think it's especially important to note here that Black trans women are experiencing monumental rates of police misconduct and other forms of violence, not even just from police, but from everywhere, but especially from police. These alarming rates against Black trans women, and it's not getting a ton of attention, so I encourage you to seek out specific media on this topic. Seek out trans specific Instagram pages, Twitter pages, join email lists, email me. I can send you some articles, some information, because we're missing a lot of information that mainstream media isn't covering about the violence happening against Black trans women. Another fear was being the only transgender person in shelter, being isolated because of this, not having anyone to relate to, not seeing anyone, client or service provider, with whom they identify. So being fearful of, even if I do seek services, am I going to be the only transgender person there? Am I going to have to educate my provider? This is important. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Another huge fear they experienced, and it gets its own slide, is related to documentation. So 41% of trans folks do not have the identification that matches their gender identity. So there's a good chance that their gender identity and the appearance on their driver's license doesn't match. So this can also be something that outs them. This goes for driver's licenses, insurance cards, birth certificates, social security cards, and a lot of times service providers will use this lack of documentation against them. Or because of that fear of being outed, they may not even try to access services because they know their documentation will, in a sense, out them. And documentation can be one of the hardest things for trans folks to obtain. It's expensive to change some of those documents, and some states don't always honor these changed documents. For instance, Tennessee is one of the only states, or is the only state, if I'm not mistaken, that doesn't honor a changed birth certificate. One of the next biggest reasons that trans folks are hesitant to reach out for assistance is that service providers aren't being trans welcoming, or they aren't seen as being trans friendly. This one has to do with the specific service provider or the service agency and their attitude towards the transgender community. And Shan asked, what was that state again? Tennessee. Tennessee is the only state that does not honor a changed birth certificate. This attitude towards transgender people and even their reputation in the communities they serve, this is seen in little ways, little representations on their building, who they invite to their events and have speaking at their events, what trainings they're putting on. Trans folks will ask themselves, will I be welcome there? Is this an environment that I will feel comfortable in? Will people be comfortable if I'm there? And rural communities especially have an even bigger problem because, as we know, most rural places can be more conservative politically and religiously, and this speaks to their homophobic or transphobic ideas. Not always, but that does play a big part of it in rural areas. So trans folks will have harder times finding jobs, seeking services, getting the right medical care in rural places. And on the other hand, I do want to note that rural communities sometimes have this attitude of we take care of our own, no matter what our own looks like. So that can sometimes be a good thing when it happens, but can also be a big barrier. This next one surrounds an organization's cultural competency. As soon as that trans person walks in the door, are they going to be treated with respect? Is the staff trained on serving underserved populations like trans people? So if the previous reason, trans welcoming, is about the organization's attitude, then this one is about the organization's skills. A way to look at this is, I'll give you a personal anecdote. My partner is vegetarian, and I also don't eat pork or beef. So for Christmas, one of my aunts, who's extremely thoughtful, she made all of us breakfast kits. I think she ordered them from like Schwann's or something, I don't know. But they were just pre-bought, pre-made kits. But because they didn't have any vegetarian ones, she went through the extra steps to making us our own breakfast kit with vegetarian sausage for my partner, with turkey bacon for me, and all these sorts of things. So she had the necessary information, and the information was knowing our diets, being aware of what we eat and what we don't, and putting that information to use. It's including us, sure, but it's also making us feel like part of the family. And then meanwhile, my partner's family still, quote, forgets to make things that she can eat, and she's been vegetarian for like 5 years. It's just that extra level of effort that an organization puts into being prepared to welcome everyone. It's not expensive to be inclusive, but it is costly. And let me say that again, it's not expensive to be inclusive, not expensive in terms of money or objects or things you need to obtain, but it is costly, and that it will undoubtedly cost someone their safety and even their life because they don't feel welcome asking for help. Another reason sort of related to cultural competency is worrying about whether or not the providers are going to ask invasive questions. Are they going to ask about their genitals or their surgical status, which helps the providers, we know, but they're not always asked in the most tactful ways. Besides that, people outside of the service provider world, their peers and family even, trans people have almost always been asked some sort of invasive question that is highly inappropriate. Trans people might be wondering, am I going to have to educate this provider? Will they use my pronouns correctly? When a trans person is in crisis, that is not the time for them to have to teach someone about what it means to be transgender. Another barrier is not knowing what services are out there, what services are available to them, or even are they going to find a place, and if they do find a place, finding out that the service is unavailable to them. And especially in rural areas, those services might be 2, 3, 5 hours away from them. So those services are quite literally out of reach. So a lot of times they'll look to online services, which, as we know, are not always the most informative and not always the most positive. And now the fifth barrier is reputation. We sort of touched on it a little bit, but I can't stress how important this factor is when trans folks are seeking services. The transgender community, especially in rural areas, but truly of any area, is a very tight-knit community. So when one person has a particularly negative experience somewhere, word will spread quickly. These experiences can paint an organization as incompetent, as being unwelcoming or uninformed and uneducated on cultural topics. This sort of thing will follow an organization, and it's really hard to regain that trust within the community. Sometimes this is even an untruthful comment or something that's not even true about what the agency did wrong, but once that thing is spread, it does damage, and it's really hard to get back from that. This next barrier is a huge one, not even just for transgender clients, but for lots of other clients who identify as male, as LGBTQ+, as non-binary. And it's that a lot of agencies have been cis woman focused for decades. Sexual assault and domestic violence movements emerged out of feminist and women's movements, and we even have the Violence Against Women Act. And so despite these things changing because non-woman survivors are stepping out about abuse and assault, many organizations are still woman-focused. I know of several shelters that say that they're inclusive and co-ed, but when it comes down to it, they're housing their women survivors in shelter, but they're putting their male survivors in hotels. That's not inclusive. That's not making a seat at the table. That's not making an extra breakfast kit for Christmas. Many agencies still have names like the Women's Center or Bethany's House, or something that sends a sort of women-focused message. So folks who don't identify as a woman or they're transgender in any way, they wonder if they're even welcome there. And a lot of their websites, their posters, their outreach materials will only feature women's pictures or use language referencing women. Transgender folks see this and feel hopeless because they think this agency is saying, look at what our idea of a survivor is. Those are the people we're here to help, not you. So Christine asked, what does it mean to be cis woman focused? So the difference between woman focused and cis woman focused. Cis woman focused is a cisgender woman is a woman who is not a transgender woman. So that woman's gender identity aligns with the sex she was assigned at birth. That's all I mean when I say that. So these shelters are women focused, but they're especially cis women focused. And that's one of the barriers that keeps transgender folks from coming to them. So the 7th, 8th, and 9th barriers I grouped all together because most likely if you've been in the direct service world for a while, you know these to be true for all survivors. But we will look at them as they relate specifically to trans experiences. These are, sorry, I was reading the questions. These are stigmas, embarrassments, shame, the concern that it will make things worse, the retaliation, and then the cost of treatment. So with that first one, in order to get a forensic exam for a sexual assault, trans folks have to go through this process of being asked questions that are specific to their genitalia. For example, if a trans man is sexually assaulted vaginally, it may be difficult or feel embarrassing to seek services. It may even be more physically or emotionally painful for them to have those physical exams related to that part of their body. And even in trans men who have transitioned and are fully presenting as male, they can adopt that attitude of, well, sexual assault can't happen to me because sexual assault doesn't happen to men, because, like I said earlier, our services for so long have been women focused. This can be extremely stigmatizing when it does happen. And then you also have feelings of isolation related to being trans, especially in rural areas. If they seek services for an assault or an incident of abuse, they might need to disclose that they're trans. Then they deal with issues in court related to documentation, community stigmas, or other negative ideas. Additionally, we know that polyvictimization is extremely common and is extremely common in transgender survivors. So seeking services for a current victimization might bring up trauma from past or childhood instances. And as well, this especially goes for small communities. Their abuser may find out and seek retaliation. So there may also be this idea of, I don't want to out this person as abusive because they're also trans, and I don't want to give the community a bad name. We see this one a lot. I was just dealing with a case, just to give you all an example, where an abuser was trans and was using the fact that his license still said F on it in court as grounds for the case to be dismissed as domestic violence. And the victim was hesitant to come forward for years because she knows the trans community is already so ostracized and she didn't want to make it worse. And as far as costs go, court systems are often very expensive. Healthcare costs are very expensive. And as we know from the data, trans people experience job discrimination, which often leads to them being unemployed or having low-paying jobs. So this can mean that trans folks don't have health insurance or have minimal health insurance and have to pay out of pocket for their hormones or for any sort of medical visit. And for this, I want us to consider a trans person's needs. Their needs to have food, shelter, or water. Those needs may outweigh their need for care following domestic violence or sexual assault. And I think that's one of the reasons why, as service providers, it's important for us to remember that victims' basic needs need to be met before we can help them with their emotional or medical needs. And that's just a reminder that everyone deserves access to healing services and not have their life ruled by their trauma. The 10th and final barrier that I will talk about today is the barrier surrounding systemic problems. And this is, of course, true for trans survivors and non-trans survivors. These issues surround not being believed, how the legal system and sometimes medical system often re-traumatizes or re-victimizes individuals, about how few prosecutions take place, or the dozens of hoops that survivors have to jump through in order to have access to services. So a lot of these barriers, like I said in the beginning, are also common issues for any survivor. With the additions of documentation for trans folks, or the issue of not being seen as a domestic abuse case, or access to systems because of a lack of resources, these are especially true for transgender folks. And now we will, with that, we will talk about sheltering trans and non-binary survivors. So a lot of shelter folks have asked me, well, what if it makes one of my survivors uncomfortable to have a trans person here? If I can speak bluntly, they usually, not always, but usually ask this question, not because it would make a survivor uncomfortable, but because it makes them uncomfortable. When I worked in shelter, it was a co-ed, all-inclusive shelter. I only ever encountered one person who was uncomfortable with sharing a room with a transgender survivor. And when I sat down and talked to the survivor who was uncomfortable, I suggested he just spend some time with the transgender survivor as a fellow survivor and remove that label of being trans. I said, just forget that part. Respect his pronouns, but nothing else should matter. He's a survivor just like you are. And he admitted to me that it was because he was raised to believe transgender folks were abominations and all these horrible things. But after spending time getting to know this other person, the transgender person, he found nothing abominable about him. So encouraging clients to be open-minded is key. Also, remembering that your shelter, if you receive federal funding, has to be trans inclusive. If you receive funds from the Violence Against Women Act or from the Office for Violence Against Women, you are legally obligated to provide safety and shelter to all survivors, regardless of perceived or actual race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, race, or disability. And you can find this information. Now that picture up there, that is or this slide, that is a screenshot of the actual PDF. But the PDF link is right there, and you can visit it at your own pace. I think you can also just Google discrimination clause in Violence Against Women Act or Office for Violence Against Women, and it'll come up very easily. But just remember that you are legally obligated. Once transgender folks are in your care, I want you to remember the terminology paradox that we talked about earlier. Inclusive phone intakes, call logs, computer systems. Remember when asking questions to be inclusive. Their gender might not fit in your boxes, so make sure you give them a box. One really good tip for asking someone's pronouns is just to introduce yourself, like, hi, I'm Chloe and I use she, her pronouns. What can I do for you today? What can I help you with today? Or whatever that sounds like for you and your agency. Making it a part of your everyday language makes you more inclusive, makes your organization more inclusive. Also, intake questions about relationship status. Are your relationship status questions just geared towards heterosexual people, monogamous people? Are they just single versus married? Because when it's just single versus married, what about folks in committed relationships? So there are things like that that you need to consider. Remember to respect their pronouns, and if you mess up, because you will, it's all right. We all mess up sometimes, and that's okay. If you mess up, apologize and move forward. Don't make a huge deal out of it. Apologize, correct yourself, and move forward. Listen carefully to their needs, and remember that they are not just a trans person. They are trans, and they are a survivor, and they are a person of color, or they are disabled, or whatever those identifiers might be. Remember to consider the person as a whole when finding services and when case managing with them. Bathrooms. Understand that I understand that your organization might be renting and might not be able to create an all gender inclusive bathroom. So then a good way around that is to hang up a sign on the bathroom door or near it, even inside of it, that says, "We expect people to be treated with respect with regard to what bathroom they use." And that's a simple sign to hang up that lets transgender people know that they are welcome there. Because bathrooms is such a huge debate, and we'll talk more about it in a little bit, but just that simple sign is super helpful. So having LGBTQ literature in your waiting rooms, lobbies, trans-specific would be even better, but we understand that's a specific group that you might not be able to find exact literature on. Have patience and compassion with your survivors, of course, but especially your transgender and gender non-conforming clients. They might not open up as quickly as some of your cisgender clients because of the barriers that we talked about, but also because of personal barriers they may have. You never know, so be patient with them and always, of course, trauma-informed. Having a diverse staff also gives you space to be diverse and inclusive, and this will make queer survivors feel much safer and more comfortable seeing themselves in your staff. When thinking about safety planning, it's important to remind trans survivors of some of the things they need to have prepared besides the typical bag of clothes, a place to stay, a safe place to go, a safe time to call. They need important documents and things you would normally tell a victim to plan for, but many trans folks use hormones, most often testosterone and estrogen. Hormone use is highly correlated with economic status and access to health care, even though many insurance providers still routinely deny coverage of hormones. Trans men are more likely to have had some form of transition-related surgery than trans women or non-binary individuals. The US Transgender Survey reported that 42% of trans men have had some sort of transition surgery, whereas 28% of trans women had had some sort of transition surgery. And anyway, if the victim is taking hormones, remind them to pack, bring those, and be sure to help them to secure a place to receive hormone therapy once they're in shelter. And just another plug that Planned Parenthood provides hormone therapy at little to no cost to transgender patients. So be mindful of their documents. Remind them to bring their documents, even if they don't align with their gender identity, because they will be helpful in gaining documents that do align or in just seeking other services. Many transgender survivors will also have prosthetics that they are bringing with them, so be mindful of that. Remind them that your shelter does not offer those, although you may, during case management or whatever, you may try to help the victim find a place who does offer prosthetics. Also remember that trans survivors of intimate partner violence may be undocumented or may live on tribal lands. So just to note that the scope of this webinar will not address some of those specific challenges impacting them, but remind them that your services are for all victims, all survivors, and remind them of the things that they will need to bring. Transgender survivors may have physical needs that you aren't prepared for, so it's imperative to be proactive and consider the things that you should have on hand for when you do get a transgender person in shelter. Think about wigs, scarves, binders, head wraps, razors, etc. Some of these things you'll have on hand, some that you won't. Consider your bags that you may take to the hospital for sexual assault, and keep these as gender neutral as possible. Consider keeping more than one in specific sizes. It's key to have clothes in all sizes. Have some bigger women's clothing, for trans women, some smaller male clothing for trans men. Be sure to ask for these when you're making your donation lists, because, and this is really important, as we discussed earlier, the trans community is really tight-knit. So if your agency is posting or requesting trans-specific supplies while a victim is in shelter, this could possibly let people know they're there, and thus lose their safety, break their confidentiality. So sheltering transgender or non-binary survivors. Gender-integrated shelters are likely the best option for most transgender folks. Housing that is already designed to include people of all genders is going to be a logical and smooth fit for the majority of folks of trans experience. Not all cities or communities have gender-integrated shelters, so other options may need to be explored if this type of housing isn't available. But if it is available, some specific concerns for trans folk at gender-integrated shelters include room sharing. Since many shelters have shared rooms rather than single rooms or a limited number of single or family housing options, many people will have a roommate. A trans person's shared room assignment in an all-gender shelter should be based on their self-identification and their own understanding of where they will be safest, where they will feel safest, not on their surgical status, their body, the way they present, or documentation markers, the name or gender on their driver's license. Staff should discuss with them whether they are concerned about any safety issues or any other concerns in placing them with a roommate. Additionally, safety measures might include placement near the overnight staff desk or the office to provide an added level of comfort. Whatever decision is made, it should be made with the full involvement of the trans survivor, and it should never be made for them. Gender-integrated shelters may already be mindful of things like the colors of paint on the walls or other design elements that tend to be typically associated with one gender. One shelter we worked with noted that, quote, "We design the bedrooms so that they're not feminine oriented. We do that so that anyone can be comfortable there. The rooms are comfortable for people who are in difficult circumstances. That's it. We partner with a quilting group who makes the colorful quilts to be gender neutral on purpose. We also make lap throws and the clients get to take that with them. We try to make it as much of a home as possible." Now that is making a breakfast kit for Christmas. Getting dressed may be more involved for some trans survivors, more than simply putting on their clothes. Some may need additional levels of privacy and time to get ready for their day. So for example, some trans men will need to bind their chest and or adjust the packing devices to achieve a more masculine appearance. Binders or chest compression shirts, packing devices, makeup to thicken the appearance of facial hair, or alternatively for trans women to create more feminine features, and other devices are not optional or minor accessories. Rather, they help define trans survivors' presence in their body and their body in alignment with their gender identity. They also provide a level of safety from the disproportionate violence experienced by people who are seen as deviating from gender roles or gender norms. So disrobing at bedtime may also pose some unique challenges. For a trans man who is dependent on a binder or chest compression shirt, for example, he may be hesitant to take it off before bed if he is rooming with another resident. His binder may be a primary component of appearing masculine, and its removal may disclose his identity. It's important to note that it is medically recommended to take breaks in binder wearing. Binders should not be worn 24/7 because they can cause harm to a person's breathing, their posture, and even their skin if worn continuously. If a trans man has had top surgery, he may have concerns about his roommate seeing the scars on his chest. This is similarly true if he has had genital surgery or any skin grafting for gender-related services. And all of these also go for trans women. For example, many trans women will spend more time closely shaving their face if they've not had electrolysis done and applying makeup. So when possible, shelters should consider incorporating room dividers in shared rooms to afford more privacy between beds and areas where residents may be disrobing. And dividers should be placed in all shared rooms so that all residents are treated equally, because if dividers are provided only in a room housing a trans person, that's going to draw unnecessary attention to them. And that may inadvertently disclose their trans history. And one of the most discussed topics for both trans and non-trans people is bathrooms. In general, people enter restrooms to use the toilet, wash their hands, check the mirror to make sure their appearance is the way they would like it to be. Gender-specific bathrooms are a source of stress for many transgender people. A recent study in 2015 showed that 75% of trans folks sometimes or always avoided public or semi-public bathrooms in the past year. A third of respondents avoided drinking or eating entirely, so they wouldn't even need to use the restroom. Unfortunately, there's this pervasive myth that trans people pose some sort of risk to non-trans people in bathrooms. And the reality is that the people who are most often in danger when using public and semi-public restrooms are trans people themselves. So to help create an environment where everyone can use the restroom with minimal fear or danger, here are some easy suggestions. Have at least one gender-neutral bathroom. If you have single stall bathrooms, it's easy to convert all of them to any gender bathrooms. You can keep all bathrooms unassigned. In other words, just don't put gendered signs on any bathroom door. Make sure that all bathrooms have locks. When bathrooms are sex segregated, multi-stall or multi-person, have signage that reminds all the users that everyone has the right to use the bathroom to determine which bathroom aligns with their identity. Similar to bathroom, shower privacy is important to most people. Like dressing and undressing, trans folks may have concerns about others seeing their binders, their packing devices, their chest, their genitalia, their scars, taking their makeup off. Bathrooms and shower areas that have locked doors or are designed for single users are the best option for maintaining bodily privacy and increasing feelings of safety. If locks aren't possible, drapes or partitions. That's an easy, quick, really inexpensive source that can provide some level of privacy. One all-gender shelter recommended having staff set the "it's not a problem" tone. They said, quote, "Integrating bathrooms has really been a non-issue because the agency treats it like it's a non-issue. If we treated the bathrooms like they were a big deal, then clients would pick up on that and make it an issue," end quote. It is common for any survivor to enter shelter with just the clothes on their back, without the supplies and resources they may use every day. So many shelters do an excellent job of providing toiletries, clothing, and other needed supplies. Yet shelters that are relatively new to sheltering men may not realize just how much difference there is. So not only between clothing intended for men and women, but also for such basic human necessities as soap. Some trans folks may also need supplies that are trans specific. And essential to presenting as their correctly aligned gender, as well as vital for their safety, for the trans folks' safety. You should stock a wide variety of male underwear sizes and types, women's underwear sizes and types. Having a wide selection of sizes takes the pressure off of choosing just from a few, which may feel uncomfortable. Shoes. Many trans men wear smaller shoe sizes than non-trans men, and many trans women wear bigger shoe sizes than most non-trans women. Hats. Many trans men use hats to help them look and feel more aligned with their gender. Many trans women use scarves, wigs, head wraps. Stock a wide variety of knit, cap, baseball hats, and other hats. Toiletries. Toiletries is a big one. People of all genders have bodies that sweat and need cleaning, but personal hygiene products are often gender specific for whatever reason, with different smells, with different colors, as well as different packaging for men and women. So be mindful of how toiletries are gendered and consider stocking scentless or fragrance-free products, which are suitable for any gender and are also safer for people with chemical sensitivities. In addition, be sure to make condoms available to all men, including trans men. Razors and shaving cream. Trans and non-trans men often shave as part of their routine body care. Trans and non-trans women also shave. Menstrual products. Some trans men have periods. It's important to have a variety of products available and make sure they're accessible to all in a private location. So organizations should create programs and campaigns to prevent anti-LGBTQ harassment and violence. Community-based organizations such as community pride centers, direct service organizations, political organizations, and civic organizations can play leadership roles in changing these attitudes in order to create this culture of respect for transgender and queer communities. Community-based organizations should create public education programs, cultural events that increase public awareness of the impact of anti-LGBTQ+ hate violence, transgender hate violence, programs like the Transgender and Gender Identity Respect Campaign by the DC Office of Human Rights in Washington, DC. This organization aims to increase the understanding and respect for the transgender and gender nonconforming communities, and this decreases incidents of discrimination through a public awareness campaign. With affirming and respectful images of transgender communities, organizations can also create community organizing campaigns to confront homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, to confront the institutions that perpetuate these phobias, and to change anti-LGBTQ+ rhetoric, or to denounce the harmful rhetoric, or to challenge hateful programs. Put forth your effort into helping other organizations in the community stopping this rhetoric. Be that resource. So this is a quote from Forge, from one of the folks that work at Forge, and it says, maybe I've been doing this too long, but in preparing to do a presentation for a local organization this week, all I keep thinking is that I want to walk in and say trans women are women, trans men are men, and some people are neither or both. Don't worry about their genitals, their socialization, or anything except whatever services you are providing for them. Ask everyone what name and pronoun they use for themselves and then use them. End Trans 101. Obviously, I know it's not that simple, but it really kind of is, isn't it? And I have to agree, I know it's not that simple, but it really is. It is that simple. And so here are some resources as we start wrapping things up. And the top resource I want to tell you is to just be one, be a resource, be that transgender resource for your community, for your transgender community. Be the resource that people come to when they need services, when they have questions. Like I said earlier, Forge Forward is a fantastic resource. Futures Without Violence, they have all sorts of inclusive outreach materials that you can use. The Tennessee Equality Project has a, the website that's listed there is tnep.org/counseling unconditionally. And what that is a person can go on there, put in their zip code, and find a counseling service that is inclusive. Love Doesn't Hurt is an organization out of Memphis that provide services for LGBTQ+ victims of domestic and sexual violence. Sister Reach is also in Memphis, and they do everything. I mean, everything. They do HIV testing, they do outreach, they do policy lobbying and policy advocacy. So many things. So definitely check them out. The Tennessee Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence, that's where I am. You can reach out to us. We have resources. We have all sorts of things that I can send to you, that I can help you with. If you have questions, I can try to help you with them. And then Trans Bodies community resource. It was one that I just found not too long ago, and it's transbodies.com. Super simple, super quick. And it has books, it has literature, it has, they have like meetings that you can attend, that trans folks can attend, to help feel like they have a community if maybe they don't. So I strongly encourage you to check it out, to use it as a resource for your transgender survivors. It's a really great resource. And with that, I will stop talking, sort of. I will answer questions. We have several questions, so let's get down here. Tracy asks, I was wondering where some resources are for binders and other accessories needed. Are there any? Our families have limited funds. Exactly. They're extremely, binders can be expensive. I know prosthetics can be even more expensive. So finding these resources, I will strongly suggest for you to link up with your local LGBTQ+ organizations. Sometimes they will have funds that can help you access them, help your transgender folks access them, or they may already have them there at the organization. So link up with as many local organizations as you can that can help you find these queer specific and trans specific items. I know at one point there were a few places online you could go to that would send free binders. I'm thinking pointofpride.org. Point of Pride. They offer, I believe they do free chest binder donations, but you have to apply. Your families would have to apply for them, and it would depend on their financial status and their social status, or not social status, but their economic status. So I know that that's one. I think there's one specific for youth, and it is ftmessentials.org, so female to male essentials, but the acronym, just the letters, ftmessentials.com. They have free youth binders, but again, I think you have to apply for it. So all of these can kind of be a process, but are definitely worth having. And then of course you can buy them if you have those funds available. Of course, I know you don't, but honestly, just Google trans binders free trans binders, and I know that there are lots more resources, but those are the ones I'm thinking of. Casey asks, are they my sister's house? I'm not sure. I don't think so. Genuinely not sure. Just check out sisterreach.org. I'm not super familiar with my sister's house, and I'm only recently became familiar with Sister Reach. So Casey, you'll just have to check that one out. The transgender population, this is from Christine. The transgender population we have worked with has not been comfortable in our support group, as it usually doesn't include other transgender or non-binary members. I have had difficulty finding victims support groups to help. Suggestions. My first suggestion is just me saying be one. Be that. Create your own transgender or non-binary support group. If you can't find one, create one. I know that online support groups, especially in our current pandemic, online has become the thing to do, the thing to be in. So if you can't find a local in-person transgender support group, create one online, because that's more accessible anyway. That can also provide a sense of safety, a sense of covertness if they're not out. So I think online is also a super, super great tool. And I think RAIN, the RAIN network, I think that they had, a few years ago, they had some grants available for online sexual assault support groups. So I would definitely check that out. That's RAINN. Casey said, to answer your question, Casey suggested Underworks. Underworks, I'm not familiar with that. So thank you for sending that, Casey. Underworks is a great place to also find binders and other prosthetics and other resources. Thank you. And Tracy, yes, I can send you those resources if you will send me an email. And my email is just my first initial, C. McMurray, my last name, C. McMurray at TennesseeCoalition.org. So if you will email me, remind me what resources I'm sending you, tell me where you're from, I can send you those resources, and I can, if anyone's interested, I can also send out this PowerPoint, and of course it will be on YouTube later. So if there's any other questions, Anybody else have anything, any comments, questions, concerns? All right, it doesn't look like it. So with that, we will go ahead and wrap up. I thank you so much for coming today. I hope it was helpful. I hope you learned a lot. And if you need anything in the meantime, you have my email, you have my work number. And if you don't, call the coalition and they'll give it to you. So you can easily reach me. I want to be accessible and want to be a resource for you. So thank you for coming today, and I hope you all have a great afternoon and a great rest of your week. Thank you.